In this section, we're going to set up for recording audio, or tracking as it's sometimes known. I'll be working predominantly in the track view, but it's possible to access the same controls from the console view. But within the track view, we'll see the waveform being drawn as recorded. Some of this section will apply to audio tracks only, and some to MIDI only. I'll mention these cases as we get to them. First, we'll have a quick look at the recording modes. These control how Sonar stores and handles the clips that are recorded. This is a per project setting, so it's possible to have a different setting saved with each project. Right-click on the record button in the transport module, and that gives us quick access to the recording preferences. Let's have a look at these options. If sound on sound is selected, any recorded material will be placed in the track with existing material, but in separate clips. Nothing is overwritten, and if there is already audio or MIDI data on a track, you will hear that as you record, unless the track, take lane or clips are muted. Overwrite will replace existing clips with the newly recorded material. This deletes any existing clips in the track, and any clips already on the track won't be heard while recording. Allow arm changes during playback record. If this is checked, you'll be able to arm a track on the fly and record or unarm a track if one's already armed. If it isn't checked, you'll need to stop playback before changing the record arm status of a track. The Only for Inputs in Project option is only selectable when the above allow arm changes is selected. This will restrict the recording inputs available to those that are already assigned as a track input. You may see some performance benefit using this option if you use WDM drivers. Auto punch when selected will only allow recording to happen between the times specified. These can be manually entered into the time boxes or selected by time region. That region can also be selected from the track view, as we saw earlier, and we'll look at it again later. Mute previous takes will keep the existing material in the punch region muted while using the sound on sound mode. Uncheck it if you want to hear the existing material. It will have no effect while loop recording though. Previous takes are always automatically muted then. Under the loop recording section, there is a choice to decide how takes are stored. Store takes in a single track will keep all recorded clips in one track, which makes comping a track much easier, and are also easier to manage. The Store Takes in Separate Track option will create a new track for each pass of the loop. An advantage of this method is that separate processing can be applied when listening back to them. But if there are multiple takes of multiple instruments, the project track count can become very large, making track management harder. Create a new layer on overlap will automatically create a new take lane if two clips overlap each other and you already have the take lanes expanded. Group clips across tracks will place clips that are recorded into multiple tracks into editing groups. Each loop pass will be placed in its own group. This is particularly useful when multi-tracking drums, for example, and will make editing of all those tracks much easier. Clips can be ungrouped at any stage and grouped after the event as well if you wish. We'll look at grouping in more detail at the editing stage. Once you've finished setting your options, click on OK. Now that we've decided what mode we're going to record in, we need to choose the correct inputs for what we want to record. For audio, this is done by selecting the correct input from the track's input drop-down box. An audio track can be either mono or stereo. There are no hard and fast rules, but a good rule of thumb is audio should be recorded in mono unless it's a stereo instrument, such as a hardware synth for example. Pairs of mono tracks can be panned fully left and right as easily as a stereo track is used, perhaps on drum overheads for example. There's a few time-saving trips here that apply to both audio and MIDI tracks. If you want to assign the same input to more than one track, we can use quick grouping that we looked at earlier. Simply select all the tracks you wish to assign an input to, and then hold down the Control key while choosing the input. All of the selected tracks will have their inputs set to your choice. Another helpful feature for audio track inputs is the Selected Track Input Series option. This will automatically assign any selected tracks a series inputs, starting with the chosen one as a first input. Very helpful, for example, if miking a drum kit with mics on consecutive inputs. For example, if I select 9 audio tracks and then choose Selected Track Input Series on the first one, I then choose the first input from the Assign drop-down and then click OK. Choosing a mono input will assign mono inputs to all of them. Choosing a stereo input will assign the rest stereo inputs. The following 8 tracks now have all their inputs assigned to the correct input in sequence. If I open the console view, we'll be able to see that much easier. Now you can see here, track 2 is assigned to the right Z12, track 3 to the left 3-4, and so on. Just as useful for non-sequential multiple assigns is the selected track inputs choice. To use this option, choose it from the input drop-down. Any pre-selected tracks will already be selected here. Now each track can be assigned one at a time or in groups of 2 or more by multi-selecting them as required and assigning the required input. Use the Control key to multi-select if need be. You can see that sets all those tracks to the left Z12 input. MIDI tracks can be selected as well as audio tracks, but obviously only the correct type of input will be available for each. You can't choose an audio input for a MIDI track, for example. This time I'm going to use Shift Select to select some audio and MIDI tracks. And I can now assign audio inputs to the selected audio tracks and MIDI inputs for the MIDI track. And as you can see, they've all been set as required. Once you've completed all of the required assignments, click OK. MIDI input presets are another helpful tool at our disposal for management of MIDI inputs, especially for those with multiple input controllers. Select a MIDI track and then select Manage Presets from the input drop-down. Here we can choose our input devices and the channels required. I'll use the Omni option to deselect all of the PCR inputs, then choose inputs 1 and 3. That selection can now be saved as a preset. Multiple channels from multiple devices can be chosen if you wish. I'll select channel 10 from my SR16 and CTK671, then save them as a drums preset. Once you've set the presets up, click OK, and they will now appear as selectable inputs for MIDI tracks. To record onto a track, we need to arm it for recording. We can do this by clicking on its record button in either the track view, the console view, or the inspector. Once armed, the button turns red. Multiple tracks can be armed at once by control grouping as we saw earlier. Select the tracks required and click on one of the record buttons. There is a setting for MIDI tracks that we looked at earlier that will allow MIDI tracks to record without arming. It's found in the Preferences MIDI Playback and Recording section. Just remember that if you enable this option, it will be very easy to overwrite existing data. Remember also that if you want to be able to arm a track for recording or switch inputs during playback, you need to make sure that the relevant options are set. We looked at them earlier. To unarm all already armed tracks, click on the record icon in the mix module. New to X2 is the ability to record directly into a chosen take lane. But any existing material in the lane is overwritten regardless of the recording options mode. To do that, we need to show the take lanes, and if need be, add any lanes required. A specific lane can then be armed for recording. Just remember, any material in this lane will be overwritten. There are usually 2 ways of monitoring an audio signal that we wish to record. The first is always an option, and that is input monitoring. The main advantage of using this method is we can hear any effects that are being used on the track within Sonar as we listen back to it. Make sure that the input echo button is lit on any tracks that you wish to monitor that way. It's possible to turn input echo on while arming the track for recording. Just hold the Shift key down while clicking on the record arm switch. To automatically disable input monitoring playback while leaving it enabled for recording, check the Disable Input Monitoring During Playback option we looked at earlier. That's found in Preferences under Audio, Playback and Recording. The main disadvantage to input monitoring is it will introduce latency, but with a good interface you should be able to get this low enough that you don't notice it. If latency is an issue when live tracking, you can turn off the Live Input Plug-in Delay Compensation or PDC. This is found in the Mix module. This will force Sonar to turn off any delay compensation on live input tracks. The recorded material will still be placed correctly in the timeline, and non-live input tracks will still be compensated correctly. Only tracks with their input echo button lit will have their delay overridden. The other method of monitoring is known as direct monitoring, but whether you can do this will depend on your interface. Most interfaces support it though. It may need to be set up within your interface's software. The advantage of direct monitoring is that there is virtually zero latency, but one disadvantage is that you can't hear any effects you're using within Sonar. However, many interfaces provide a way of adding effects similar to those available within a DAW, so for example, a vocalist can still hear a reverb on their voice if they wish. As we saw earlier, input echo has a similar effect on MIDI tracks, although for different reasons. On a MIDI track, turning the input echo on ensures that the data received on a track is echoed or sent to the synth that the track is associated with. Note that incoming data will be echoed to any track that is receiving the incoming data and has its input echo button lit, not just the in-focus one. If you don't want to hear incoming data from a track, turn the input echo off. Regardless of any effects you have in the track's effects bin, the recorded audio is always dry, i.e. the effects aren't recorded. If for some reason you want to record the effects, you'll need to perform a bounce as soon as you've recorded it. But it's advisable to leave that until export time in case you change your mind. If resources are an issue, the track can be frozen, and we'll look at freezing tracks and synths later. Although MIDI tracks do have meters, they'll just show that there is an incoming signal via a red light at the top of the meter, and the rest of the meter indicates the velocity of the incoming note. The rest of this section on meters and setting levels applies to audio tracks only. I mentioned meters early in the track view and console view, and this is when we really need them. When recording audio, we're interested in making sure that clipping doesn't occur. Clipping is when the incoming audio signal is too high and exceeds 0 dB, which in the digital world is a bad thing. As soon as that happens, the digital converters on your sound card will clip the waveform, which will result in digital distortion. Definitely not what we want. We use the meters to avoid this happening. The idea is to get a nice strong signal, but not one that is going to clip. This is what a clipped meter will look like. It's important to stress that there's no way of controlling the level of the incoming signal from within Sonar. The incoming level is set by controls on your sound card or interface, perhaps using a gain knob on the interface, but it may also be set via the interface's software. Let's look at the meter options. I'm going to use the inspector, but they're identical to the options found in the track view and console view meter options. We looked briefly at these earlier. Different options can be set for each set of meters. For now, we're only concerned with the track recording meters. The choices at the top of the menu are used to show or hide the meter type. For example, if you don't want to see playback meters, uncheck that option. The option towards the top specifies the signal type that is being metered. Peak meters the peaks of incoming audio, RMS is an average, and a peak plus RMS will meter both. RMS being displayed as a solid bar, and peak as a single segment above that. I have mine set to peak, as peak's clipping is what we are primarily concerned with when recording. The scale is at the default of -42 dB, and I also like to have hold peaks enabled. This means that the highest level a meter peaks at will be held by a marker on the meter, which will slowly decay until the next highest peak arrives. I also choose to lock peaks, which means that the peak marker will be locked at the highest peak level until another peak exceeds it. Note that lock peaks will not be selectable until hold peaks has been checked. The other meter options are identical to these, but track playback and bus meters also have an option to choose pre or post fader or pre-fader post effects. Note that the meters are also set independently from within each view, so the inspector ones that I've just set are not affecting the track view ones. They need to be set within this view. Peak markers or clip indicators can be reset by double-clicking on them. Now the meters are set up, let's set some levels. We need to play the audio source as loud as it's likely to get. A singer, for example, needs to be belting out a louder part of the song, not a quiet passage, or the drummer needs to be giving it his or her all. I like to aim for peaks of around -12 dB. That allows plenty of headroom for those extra loud sections when the performer gets carried away, but is still strong enough to give a good signal in quieter sections. Watch the meters and adjust the gain control on the interface while the audio source is playing. This is where the lock peaks option comes in handy, as you can see the highest peak that has been reached. Particularly handy if you are the producer, engineer and talent and are out of sight of the screen while playing or singing. Regardless of whether you have lock peak set or not, if the signal does clip, then the clip marker at the very top will light red and stay lit until the meters are reset. We saw that earlier. The peak level indicator will also show the numeric value of the peak. To reset the meter, left click on it. Notice as we prepare to record that there are several indicators available. The arm track or tracks display their record buttons in red, the track's clip pane area turns a reddish hue, and the arm disarm button in the control bar also lights. When recording, we can choose to record to preset tempo or tempos by playing to a metronome or perhaps a drum beat generated by an external synth. This will mean recorded audio or MIDI is played to the tempo grid as recorded, although any performance variations will of course remain. I explained the metronome preferences early in the project template setup video, and the metronome is turned on or off by clicking on the metronome record button. It's possible to listen to it while a project is playing back as well. Note that the metronome itself isn't recorded. If you don't want to record to a set tempo, it's perfectly possible to record in free time and adjust the tempo grid to align to the recorded material later. I'm going to switch that off for now. I have a metronome 1 bar count in setup, which will stop when recording starts. I'll arm the MIDI track as well, which is generating the audio here, and we'll see both record. Start to record by clicking on the record button. When finished, click on stop. You'll notice that a waveform or MIDI clip is drawn as we record, and it's actually a rough estimation of the waveform. The correct one won't show until we stop recording, as it has now. The recorded material is stored in clips according to the preferences that we set up earlier. There are variations to recording rather than just pressing record followed by stop when we've finished. The first variation is loop recording. We looked at looping earlier. This is set up in a very similar way, except for we'll be recording rather than playing back. This can be helpful if you want multiple takes of a section, perhaps for harmonies, or to try different ideas over a section. You can of course also comp together a single take from multiple ones. We'll look at comping when we get to editing. To set up the loop, use your preferred method to select the area you want to record. I'm going to time select in the ruler, then right click and select loop points. There are a couple of preferences to think about here, and we looked at those earlier. One is whether to put a new pass into the same track or a different track. When using this method, tracks or take lanes aren't actually created until after you press stop, at which point a clone of the original track is created for each pass made, or a take lane is created depending on your choice. There's no right or wrong, and the best option really depends on what you're going to do with the material afterwards. If I'm recording several passes because I want to create harmonies, I tend to record those into a fresh track each time. If I'm recording so I can comp one track from them, I record into one track. That's just a personal preference. Once the loop is set up, it's just a matter of following the same procedure as basic recording. The difference now being that at the end of the loop, the now time will jump back to the loop start and a fresh take will be recorded each time. So let's press record. Once recorded, takes can be broken out into take lanes by clicking on the take lane icon. The only other choice to make is whether to use overwrite mode or sound on sound. The only difference between these two modes is that in overwrite mode, each clip will be muted as it's placed in the track if using the same track option. It will not overwrite the previous take. Punch recording is useful for replacing an area of an existing recording, perhaps for correcting a mistake or inserting a different phrase. Here's a guitar recording with some bum notes around measures 7, 8 and 9. To correct that, I'm going to drag select measures 6 through 9 and then select punch points from the right-click context menu. This will automatically turn punch recording on. Let's move the now time back to the start of the clip. I have overwrite as my recording preference as I'm replacing material. And when I press record, playback will start, but no recording will take place until the punch in point is reached. Then the new material will either be added to existing material if in sound mode, or as in this case, replaced if in overwrite mode. Once the punch out point is reached, recording stops. You'll hear me playing along to the recorded material as I come up to the punch in point. That's to help with my timing. To get started, we press record. As you can see, the recorded material fills the gap. Now for a rewind to the start of that. Press play. Should sound a little bit better, hopefully. Punch recording can be combined with loop recording as well, so several takes can be inserted into the same region. Just set a loop up over the punch region, although it's probably better to set a larger loop region so that you get to hear a lead into the punch region. As well as recording material into Sonar, we can also import it. As we've seen previously, the easiest way to import audio and video into Sonar is to drag it in from the browser, but it's also possible to import audio via the File menu. One advantage is that tracks from a CD can be imported directly from the CD into an audio track. Regardless of what is being imported, the insertion will happen at the now time. Now is probably a good time to mention saving information in a file, as the tracking stage is one of the likely times that you'll need to add more information about the project or clips. Perhaps you need to make a note of the guitar, pickup and amplifier combination used on a track, just in case you ever need to retrack it, or perhaps you'd like to add special instructions on playback. Individual track information can be stored in the Track Properties text box on each individual track, accessed by Shift plus Control plus I. Alternatively, just click on the Track tab of the inspector. Double-click in the description box to enter text. If you're using take lanes, you can click in the individual takes text description area on each take. Information about the file in general can be stored in the File Information area, accessed by selecting Project Info from the main menu. Here you can enter the information relative for each box, and there's also an information area at the bottom. Once you've finished editing here, press the Escape key. Finally, now we have some material recorded, it'll be a good idea to save it. That's done by clicking on File Save or pressing Ctrl S. File Save As will create a fresh file if you wish to keep more than one version. We looked at versioning and autosave earlier. Navigate to where you want to keep the file and click Save. The normal save file is a CWP file, but there are other options to use if you wish.